Okay, so imagine, right? Imagine trying to really wrap your head around what reality even is. But then you discovered that, like, the very tools you're using to understand it, those are also kind of part of the illusion.
Whoa.
It's a total head trip. And that's exactly what we're going to dive into today, the thought of Tsongkhapa. He was this, like, brilliant Tibetan philosopher back in the 14th century, and his ideas, well, let's just say they still mess with Buddhist thinkers and philosophers in general, even you and me sitting here right now.
Yeah, Tsongkhapa, or Tsongkhapa, if you want to try to pronounce it closer to the Tibetan, his full name was Losang Dragpa, lived from 1357 to 1419. And he really is a titan, right? Like, he's this incredibly influential figure in Tibetan Buddhism. And he didn't just stick to one thing. I mean, he was all about integrating theory and practice, but always with like a laser focus on ethics, the rules of monastic life, and then all the scholarship and meditation within, esoteric Buddhism. What really grabs me, especially as a philosopher, is this real drive to create a complete system.
So, I'm already hooked. Lay it on me. What are we, like, really trying to understand about Tsongkhapa's philosophy?
All right, so the mission today, the big picture, is to get a grip on his core philosophical contributions.
Okay.
And one of the most important things there, from everything I've read at least, is his take on the Madhyamaka doctrine of the two truths.
I've heard of that.
It's subtle, it's complex. But basically, he built this really robust sense of, like, everyday realism, like the world we experience, all while saying it all takes place within this larger, all-encompassing illusion.
Okay, so how do you even, like, know anything for sure in that kind of a setup? I mean, that's got to be a philosopher's nightmare.
Exactly. That's what makes this so fascinating.
So how do we approach Tsongkhapa? Like, where are we getting all this info from?
Well, we're drawing on two main things. So first, you have his own writings, which are super extensive. They cover, like, everything under the sun, really.
He was prolific.
He was. And second, there's this awesome biography by one of his students, Kedra Pelzanko. It's called Stream of Faith. And I think it helps to think about Tsongkhapa's life in two parts. Now, he was always developing his ideas, but it's around 1400 CE that his, like, fully mature system kicks in, and he just explodes with all this work.
So before we go there, like, what's the world Tsongkhapa is stepping into? I mean, he's not coming out of nowhere, right?
No, not at all. See, he's living after the final version of the Kangyur, the Buddhist canon, got put together.
So the books are, like, set in stone, so to speak.
Yeah. So he's entering a really well-established intellectual scene. And there are all these debates going on already, right, about how to interpret the core Buddhist philosophies, especially this Madhyamaka, the middle way stuff.
Makes sense.
And the big thing a lot of people are arguing over, different interpretations of Nagarjuna. He's this foundational figure in Madhyamaka.
Right.
And there are two main camps. You've got Chandrakirti with his consequentialist approach, that's the Prasangika school, which, they really go after contradictions and other views to reveal the emptiness of inherent existence.
Okay.
And then there's Bhavaveka and his autonomist approach, the Svatantrika school. They're trying to prove emptiness with their own independent logical arguments. Tsongkhapa, he very clearly picks a side, aligns himself with Chandrakirti, the consequentialist interpretation.
Interesting. So it's like philosophers today debating, like, the problem of universals or whatever. They pick a team.
Yeah, totally. It's all about figuring out whose arguments are the most solid.
Right. So teams. Now, you also mentioned this whole Indo-Tibetan logic and knowledge tradition, the Pramasar tradition, the focus on, like, valid ways of knowing stuff. Where does that fit in?
Oh, that's huge.
Yeah.
It's a big piece of the puzzle. See, the Pramasar tradition, Dignaga and Dharmakirti started it, and it was a game changer. Gave everyone this sophisticated way to think about knowledge, logic, how our minds actually work to know things.
Yeah, I can see how that would be relevant.
Tsongkhapa, he takes this whole rigorous Pramodo approach and weaves it right into his Madhyamaka framework. For him, it wasn't enough to just talk about, like, the ultimate nature of reality. He also wanted to know how we could have any reliable knowledge in the everyday world, given all this talk about illusion.
It makes sense. Otherwise, it just becomes a bunch of, like, abstract speculation, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's grounding it. And as you mentioned earlier, he was super concerned with how intellectual understanding and actual practice fit together. He called it orthodoxy and orthopraxy. He really believed that if you get emptiness right, that should directly shape how you act, how you live your life, how you do your spiritual practice.
So it's not just head knowledge. It's got to have real-world implications.
Absolutely. And that's what makes him so relevant to us today. Okay, so we've got the context, the Buddhist canon, the philosophical debates, and this emphasis on knowing and doing. Ready for some of Tsongkhapa's core ideas.
Hit me.
All right, so emptiness of intrinsic existence. That's like the big one. In Tibetan, it's Vavavashunya.
Try saying that 3 times fast.
Right. But basically, it means that nothing truly exists by itself, like inherently, independently. Everything depends on other things and even on our concepts, on how we think about them.
Okay, I'm following so far.
But here's the real head spinner. Even that statement, that everything is empty, that's only conventionally true. It's not some absolute truth about reality. It's not some big exception.
Right, so even emptiness is empty.
Exactly. Nothing is inherently real, not even emptiness itself. And that has huge implications for how we understand both our everyday world and any claims to ultimate truth.
That's some next level stuff right there.
It is. So if even the ultimate truth is kind of provisional, how does he make sense of morality, of right and wrong? I mean, that all happens in the everyday world, right?
Yeah, like if everything's an illusion, does it even matter how we act?
That's the question. And this is where his hermeneutics come in. So he created this way of interpreting Buddhist teachings that says, yeah, moral statements, ethical principles, they're valid at the conventional level, even if ultimately they're also empty.
Clever.
And the guy was a writing machine. He produced over 300 works, like I said. And throughout all that writing, he's always trying to reconcile this idea of emptiness with the idea that ethical conduct matters, especially this altruistic principle of bodhisattva, the aspiration to reach enlightenment to help all beings. He also spent a lot of time trying to make sense of Tantric Buddhism. Like, how do those practices, some of which seem pretty wild, fit in with ordinary morality? And he ties it all together with his understanding of dependent origination.
So for him, dependent origination isn't just this like abstract idea. It's the key to understanding how all these pieces fit together.
You got it. So we're going to rewind a bit now, right?
Okay.
We got to go back to Tsongkhapa's early life, his intellectual journey. So he starts studying with this guy, Choje Dandrup Rinchen, learning mantras, receiving lay precepts, that kind of stuff.
Like Buddhism 101.
Yeah, the basics. But his journey really takes off when he heads to central Tibet. He's like a teenager at this point. And he just dives headfirst into all the major scholarly traditions, the Sangfu, the Sakya epistemological traditions, all that, plus a deep dive into Tantric Buddhism. I mean, he's studying it like all these big-name monasteries, Trikun Phil, Duwaken, Shalu, Sakya, Jonang, Bodong-yi, and Narthang.
It sounds like he was just soaking it all up.
He was. But how did all that early stuff specifically influence his later ideas? You know, especially the focus on dependent origination.
Well, it seems like that early exposure to so many different schools of thought really sharpened his critical thinking skills, you know? Gave him all the tools to build his own unique system. Like, his time with the Pramaka traditions must have been huge for that.
Absolutely. Learning about rigorous argumentation, how to really examine how we know what we know, that was crucial for him later on, especially when he sides with Pasakika Madhyamaka.
It's all connected.
Right. And on top of all that, he starts teaching pretty early on, too. He focuses on Aksuga's compendium of Abhidharma.
So he's like a prodigy, teaching Abhidharma as a young guy.
Pretty much.
That's got to be significant.
It is. The Abhidharma dives into Buddhist psychology, cosmology, all that. So engaging with that early on would have given him like a super detailed understanding of how the mind works, how the universe works, all from a Buddhist perspective.
Heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah. And then he goes on this solitary retreat, which is so important for internalizing everything he's learned, you know, developing his own insights. Yeah. It's like that time of intense solitude that often leads to really original thinking.
Like going into the cave and coming out with like philosophical superpower.
Exactly. And by 20, he's considered a master of the 4 main disciplines of Buddhist scholarship. I mean, that's crazy.
Okay, so master scholar, early teacher. Now, in this early period, he also writes these 2 works, The Explanation of the Difficult Points and The Golden Garland of Eloquence. What's the deal with those?
All right, so explanation of the difficult points, that's super interesting because it shows us Tsongkhapa starting to grapple with the Yogacara school and their whole thing about the alaya vijnana, which is like the foundation consciousness.
Okay.
So in Yogacara, it's the 8th consciousness, the basis of everything we experience. And it seems like Tsongkhapa is kind of giving it some real weight at this point, at least provisionally.
Roy, yes.
Yeah, but this is also where he's wrestling with Dolpopa's great middle way philosophy, which argues for this purer transcendental mind. Dolpopa says, look, Nagarjuna and Asaga, they're both on the same page about this.
Uh-oh. Sounds like trouble.
It is.
Yeah.
Because Tsongkhapa, later on, he straight up rejects that. He says, no, Asaga's Yogacara and Nagarjuna's middle way are different, and Nagarjuna wins. He comes to see the alaya vijnana as just like a useful tool within a flawed Yogacara system.
Yeah.
So even early on, he's already pushing back against some big names, some established ideas.
So not afraid of a good philosophical fight.
Not at all. And then there's the Golden Garland of Eloquence.
Lay it on me.
This one's a beast. It's a massive commentary on the perfection of wisdom sutras and the ornament for the clear realizations.
Sounds dense.
Oh, it is. He goes through 21 Indian commentaries, pointing out where they agree and disagree.
Yeah.
And what's super interesting, he's basically only using Indian sources, no Tibetan thinkers, as authorities.
Wow. That's a statement.
It is. He's showing off his super rigorous method, textual analysis, philology, understanding the historical context, the whole 9 yards. And in this work, he introduces this Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka idea, basically a middle way, that uses some Yogacara stuff. But, as he'll argue later, it doesn't go as deep as Chandrakirti's Prasangika interpretation.
Okay.
And he also throws some serious shade at Dolpopa's interpretation of the perfection of wisdom texts.
So it sounds like he laid a lot of groundwork in this early period, but he's not quite there yet with his mature system.
Right.
So when does that shift happen?
After the Golden Garland, things change. He spends about 10 years pretty much off the grid, away from the big intellectual centers. He's in southern Tibet, mostly, really digging deep into the Indian Buddhist texts, meditating like crazy. There are even stories about him having a philosophical dialogue with Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom.
Okay, so divine inspiration, intense study. I'm seeing the pattern here.
It's classic, right? And this is when it all comes together. Around 1400 CE, his mature philosophy crystallizes. He's integrating Vajrayana teachings in a new way, and his understanding of Madhyamaka is becoming even more sophisticated.
And this is when dependent origination and emptiness become like the central pillars, right?
Yeah. Totally. He realizes, this is it. Dependent origination, understanding that, is the key to unlocking emptiness, to solving the whole paradox of how things can be empty but still function in the world. It's like he says in praise of dependent origination. Among teachers, the teacher of dependent origination, amongst wisdoms, the knowledge of dependent origination, you, who are most excellent, like the kings in the worlds, know this perfectly well, not others.
So that's his jam, dependent origination.
It is. And he really lays out this mature philosophy in some of his most important works, like the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment and, of course, the ocean of reasoning.
I've heard of that one. It's his big commentary on Nagarjuna, right?
Yeah, Nagarjuna's root verses on the middle way. And in the great treatise, he even has this whole section where he's connecting dependent origination and emptiness, like spelling it out. He's super careful about correctly identifying the object of negation, like what are we actually saying is empty? He wants to avoid saying too much or too little. And he really believed he'd cracked the code on dependent origination, showing how you can hold this seemingly radical view of emptiness and still accept the validity of conventional truths.
That's a tough needle to thread, right? Emptiness and everyday reality.
Yeah, but he nails it.
So now we got to talk about the 8 points that are difficult to understand. Gyaltsab Dharma Rinchen, his student, laid these out.
Those are key.
Yeah, those 8 points really get at the nuances of Tsongkhapa's mature thought. Like, for example, he completely rejects the idea of particulars and the storehouse consciousness, at least conventionally, while still saying, yes, external objects exist. He's breaking away from Yogacara idealism there.
Big move.
Huge. And he also rejects this idea that you can just use any old logic to understand ultimate reality. He says, no, you got to use prasaga, which is basically showing how your opponent's views lead to absurd or contradictory conclusions.
Like a philosophical judo move.
Yeah, exactly. And it's his way of dealing with the Naika objection, which says, hey, if your arguments don't have inherent reality, then they can't really prove anything, right? But he argues that prasagikas aren't just saying everything is meaningless. They're using reasoning, even though that reasoning itself is ultimately empty, to show that all phenomena lack inherent existence.
So even his methods reflect his core ideas.
Absolutely. He's walking the walk. And that's pretty mind-blowing, right? The very arguments we use in philosophy, they're also ultimately empty.
It makes you think, right, about the nature of thought itself. What other points should we highlight for philosophers?
Well, there's the rejection of self-awareness, which is a big one. He explains memory as simply the consciousness of having seen something in the past. And he talks about basic ignorance, not as some passive potential for error, but as an active force that distorts how we see reality.
Interesting.
And then there's the whole thing about bodhicitta being the defining characteristic of authentic Mahayana Buddhism, which leads him to this really unexpected conclusion that even Hinayanists who don't emphasize bodhicitta actually have the same correct understanding of reality.
Huh.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
bit of a head scratcher. But maybe the most radical point for philosophers is that he says all appearances are ultimately false.
Oh.
And that truth at the everyday level is just a matter of convention, not about inherent reality. This even applies to the Buddha himself. Like, the Buddha knows all things, but he doesn't see them as inherently real.
That's heavy.
It is. He's really pushing us to reconsider what we think we know about, well, pretty much everything.
So with these radical views, he's going to get some pushback.
Oh, yeah, he does. Ramtan, another big thinker at the time, really went after him. But Tsongkhapa addresses those criticisms head on, especially in his later works. He clarifies his views on Chandrakirti and Bhaviveka, makes sure everyone understands the difference between Prasangika and those other Madhyamaka approaches. And, some scholars today have even pointed out that this whole debate between Svatantrika and Prasangika has some interesting parallels with stuff happening in Western philosophy. It's like a cross-cultural conversation about the nature of argument and reality. Super fascinating.
That's so cool. But it wasn't just about metaphysics for Tsongkhapa.
Right.
I mean, he was also big on hermeneutics, how we interpret texts, and ethics. So how did this emptiness thing, how did that shape those areas, especially for, like, a philosopher?
Well, for him, hermeneutics interpreting texts becomes super important. I mean, he accepts the Kangyur, the whole Buddhist canon, as legit as the Buddha's word.
Right.
But there are all these seeming contradictions in there. So he says, look, we got to use human reason to figure it all out. And any statement that claims something exists inherently, intrinsically, you can't take that literally, because if you really understand emptiness, you realize nothing has that kind of inherent reality.
So reason becomes like the ultimate filter.
Exactly. And he actually creates this whole ranking system for Buddhist philosophical schools, with Prasangika Madhyamaka at the very top. Like, that's the most accurate, the most sophisticated.
Makes sense.
And the principle of bodhicitta, that altruistic motivation, plays a key role here, too, in understanding why the Buddha might have said seemingly contradictory things. The idea is that, look, he's a perfectly enlightened being, so he's teaching in a way that benefits beings at all different levels of understanding.
Oh, I see. So it's like those contradictory statements are actually skillful. They're designed to lead different people toward the truth.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about meeting people where they are.
Fascinating. So what about his ethics? How does emptiness fit into that?
So for him, ethics isn't about following some set of absolute unchanging rules.
Okay.
It's all about understanding that suffering comes from acting in ways that don't align with how things really are. Like, if you ignore the truth of dependent origination and emptiness, you're going to create problems.
Makes sense. So are there different levels of ethics too, like his hierarchy of schools?
Yeah, totally. He has 3 main levels. Basic monastic discipline, the bodhisattva vows, and then tantric ethics. And each level builds on the one before it.
Gotcha.
But he's also pragmatic, he gets that ethical obligations might change depending on what someone's capable of, what their role is in the world. And for bodhisattvas, for example, he really emphasizes bodhisattva, that altruistic motivation, as the driving force. And then with tantric ethics, which can get kind of wild, he's basically saying that stuff is really only for, like, the spiritual elite, people who are deeply compassionate and understand emptiness. For those folks, those seemingly transgressive actions, they can actually be beneficial.
I see. So the context matters. Who you are matters.
A lot. Okay, so we've talked a lot about his philosophy, but we can't forget that Tsongkhapa wasn't just a thinker. He was a doer, too. He founded Ganden Monastery, which became the main center for the Geluk school. So how does all this Tantra stuff fit into that? What would a philosopher find interesting about how he brings it all together?
So the founding of Ganden in 1409, that was huge.
Sure.
It gave his followers a place to gather, to study. It represented his commitment to combining sutra teachings and tantra teachings, like bringing them together in practice. And later in his life, Tsongkhapa really focused on the most advanced tantric practices, the highest yoga tantra. He wrote these super influential works on it, especially on the Guhyasamaja Tantra, drawing a lot from Nagarjuna and Oryadeva. And for him, Tantra was basically a part of Mahayana Buddhism, but what set it apart was this practice of deity yoga. He also wrote a ton about other tantras and these really esoteric practices like working with energy channels and chakras. He did a lot to clarify these concepts like the illusory body and clear light, all within a tantric framework.
Yeah.
And after he died in 1419, his writings, they just spread like wildfire. They became essential texts for the Geluk tradition, which really took off after his students founded Drepung and Sera monasteries. His legacy is so multifaceted, right? He's got this really independent, approach to the Buddhist canon, this deep emphasis on understanding emptiness through critical thinking and meditation, this strong ethical system, and then this whole push for an integrated understanding of Buddhism from the most basic teachings to the most esoteric tantric practices.
So much to unpack.
So much.
Okay, so to sum up this epic deep dive, we've seen how Tsongkhapa created this incredibly sophisticated and nuanced synthesis of Madhyamaka philosophy, especially focusing on Chandrakirti's Prasangika approach. And he gave us a way to think about knowledge, even when we're saying reality is an illusion. He explained conventional and ultimate truth through dependent origination, and he brought ethics and tantra into this whole system. Like he's saying, all these different philosophical questions are all interconnected. You can't just separate them out.
It's a complete system.
Totally. And for philosophers today, I mean, Tsongkhapa is still throwing down the gauntlet, you know? He's still making us wrestle with emptiness, what it means for how we know things, for what's real, for how we should live. His work forces us to question our basic assumptions, the frameworks we use to think about the world. And on that note, here's something to ponder, a parting shot for all you philosophers out there.
Yeah.
So Tsongkhapa says, all appearances are ultimately false. How does that change how we think about our own philosophical investigations? Like, if everything we're looking at is, in some sense, an illusion, does that make our search for knowledge, for truth, pointless? Or does it point to an even deeper level of inquiry? And if you're feeling adventurous, I highly recommend checking out Tsongkhapa's major works, like The Ocean of Reasoning or The Great Treatise. Trust me, if you're into philosophy, this stuff will blow your mind.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a wild ride.